The winter of 1962 did not arrive gently. It did not give warning. On Boxing Day of that year, a mass of Arctic air descended over these islands and simply refused to leave. By January 1963, rivers had frozen solid. The Thames had ice thick enough to walk on in places. Snowdrifts reached the rooftops of terraced houses in Yorkshire and Cornwall alike. The temperature in some parts of England did not climb above freezing for 77 consecutive days. 77 days. That is not a cold snap. That is a siege. This is file number 14 of the Forgotten Britain archive. What followed those 77 days was not a national emergency in the modern sense. There were no government-issued survival kits, no emergency heating centres on every corner, no social media threads telling families what to do. There was something else instead. There was knowledge, practical, handed down, unwritten knowledge that had lived in British households since the war years and the years before that. Knowledge that has now, almost entirely, vanished. These are the methods British families used to survive the big freeze of 1963 in homes that had no central heating and in many cases no reliable fuel supply at all. If you remember that winter, or if your parents told you about it, stay with us. Every detail that follows is part of the record. The first thing families did was not what you might expect. They did not rush to buy more coal. Coal was already running short by early January, with distribution networks struggling under frozen roads and drifted over rail lines. Instead, the very first act of survival was to shrink the house, not literally, but effectively. Families in 1963 understood instinctively what took building scientists decades to codify. That heat is easier to keep in a small space than a large one. Within the first days of the freeze, most working-class households retreated entirely into 1 or 2 rooms. The front parlour, kept spotless all year for guests who never quite came, was abandoned. Bedrooms above the ground floor were closed off. Internal doors were sealed at the bottom with rolled towels or strips of old curtain fabric. The family contracted around a single source of heat, usually the kitchen range or the living room fireplace, and that room became the entire world until the thaw. In a 3-bedroom terrace in somewhere like Barnsley or Stoke, this meant 6 or 7 people occupying a space of perhaps 12 square feet around an open fire for weeks at a time. Children did their homework there. Meals were cooked and eaten there. Washing dried on a wooden clothes, horse positioned just close enough to the fire to dry, just far enough not to scorch. There was no concept of personal space in any modern sense. Proximity was warmth. Warmth was survival. But the fireplace alone was never enough. And this is where the second layer of knowledge came into play. Knowledge that had nothing to do with fuel at all. British families in 1963 understood, without being taught it formally, how to insulate a room using only what they already owned. Windows were the primary weakness. A single glazed sash window in a Victorian terrace was, thermally speaking, almost no better than an open hole in the wall. The solution was layering. Heavy curtains were drawn from the moment the light faded, sometimes by 3 in the afternoon in January. Behind those curtains, families tacked up old blankets, lengths of fabric, even opened out Hessian potato sacks. Some households taped brown paper directly onto the glass, which reduced the cold radiation from the pane itself. It looked nothing. It worked considerably better than nothing. Doors to the outside received the same treatment. Draft excluders in 1963 were not bought in shops. They were made. A long sock, filled with sand or dried rice and sewn shut at both ends, laid against the base of the door, could reduce the air coming in along the floor by a meaningful margin in a small room. In a week of sustained frost, that margin was the difference between waking up shivering and waking up able to move your fingers. The bed was its own separate science. And this is the part that younger generations find almost impossible to imagine. In an unheated bedroom in January 1963, the temperature inside could drop to within a few degrees of the temperature outside. Pipes froze inside walls. Chamber pots froze. Breath hung visible in the air long after the candle was blown out. Getting into bed in those conditions was not a comfort. It was a challenge requiring preparation. The stone hot water bottle was not optional. It was filled before supper, wrapped in a piece of flannel to prevent burns, and placed at the foot of the bed an hour before anyone got in. This pre-warmed a pocket of air under the covers that the body then maintained through the night. The practice of putting a warm brick, wrapped in newspaper, into the bed had not entirely died out by 1,963 inches more rural households. These are not myths, they are recorded domestic practices. Families slept in layers, vests, pyjamas, a jumper, sometimes a hat. 2 or 3 people sharing a bed was common and unquestioned, not from shortage of space, but from the simple physics of shared body heat. Children were often put to bed together, the eldest and youngest at either end, the middle child in between, so that no single body was at the cold edge of the mattress alone. The blankets themselves were supplemented with coats laid flat across the top of the bed, an overcoat or two providing extra weight and trapped air above the standard bedding. The weight of the coat matters more than it sounds. The compression of the air layer is what holds the warmth. None of this was taught in school. It was simply known, passed through families the way recipes are passed, without being written, without being explained, assumed to be obvious until the day it is no longer obvious to anyone. Fuel management was its own discipline entirely, and one that working-class families in 1963 had inherited directly from the rationing era. Coal was not burned freely. It was rationed within the household, just as it had been rationed by the government 20 years before. A typical family in that winter would build the fire once, in the morning, and maintain it through the day with careful additions, not shovelfuls. Specific pieces, larger lumps of coal placed on the outside edges of the fire, where they would not catch immediately but would warm and dry for an hour before being needed. Smaller pieces moved to the center when the fire needed boosting. Slack, the fine coal dust that collected at the bottom of the coal scuttle, mixed with a little water to form a paste, and packed onto the back of the fire, where it would burn slowly for hours with very little heat output, but enough to keep the fire alive through the night. That technique, banking a fire with slack, kept the embers alive overnight, so that the morning fire did not require kindling from scratch. Kindling cost effort and used paper, and in a household where a newspaper might also be insulating a window, nothing was wasted twice. Anthracite, when families could get it, burned longer and hotter than household coal. But it was harder to ignite and unforgiving if the fire was not properly drawn. The management of a coal fire was a genuine skill, no different in its complexity from cooking, and it was practiced daily by anyone who kept a household warm. If you remember banking a fire overnight, you understand something that most people under 50 cannot fully conceive of. Leave a comment below. Tell us what your family burned, and where. Food was the other pillar of survival, and it worked in ways that are more than simply practical. The body generates its own heat through digestion, and families in 1963, whether they understood the physiology or not, knew this empirically. The tradition of hot porridge at breakfast was not nostalgia in January 1963. It was a thermal strategy. Oats, simmered slowly, absorbed and held heat in a way that a slice of toast could not match. A bowl of porridge at 7 in the morning, with a thick layer of salt and a knob of dripping on top rather than sugar and milk, would sustain a person's core temperature through several hours of outdoor work or indoor cold in a way that lighter food simply did not. The midday meal, in households where there was one, was similarly weighted toward warmth and density, broths rather than soups. The distinction matters. A broth made with a marrow bone, simmered for several hours with root vegetables and barley, was a different nutritional and thermal proposition than a thin vegetable soup. The fat in the broth, the protein from the bone, the carbohydrate from the barley, all of it metabolized slowly, releasing heat over hours. Housewives in 1963 did not speak in these terms. They simply knew that this kind of cooking kept families on their feet. Bread was baked at home in many households still in 1963, and the act of baking served a double function. A bread oven running for 2 to 3 hours was also a room heater. In a small kitchen, the difference was tangible. Families timed their baking for the coldest part of the day. There is a detail from that winter that is rarely mentioned, and it is this. Many families, particularly those in urban terraces without gardens, ran out of coal entirely. Not reduced. Finished. In February 1963, with the freeze showing no sign of breaking, distribution across the Midlands and the North had nearly collapsed. Some streets in Leeds and Birmingham went without delivery for 2 and 3 weeks at a time. What those families burned, instead, is a record of practical intelligence under pressure. Old furniture. Not the good pieces. The pieces that were already failing. A chair with a broken leg, a wardrobe back panel that had come away from its frame, the wooden slats from a spare bed no longer in use. Timber burned faster and hotter than coal, but required constant attention. A family burning wood for warmth needed someone tending the fire almost continuously. This fell, as most domestic labour fell in 1963, to whoever was at home. Those who had gardens stripped them of anything that would catch. Old fence posts, rotting cold frames, the wooden handles of tools that had themselves become useless. A greenhouse frame, stripped of its glass, could provide several days of burning. None of this was illegal. None of it was unusual. It was simply what was done. The freeze broke in early March 1963. The thaw, when it came, was almost as damaging as the cold itself. Pipes that had frozen inside walls burst as the temperature rose. Ceilings came down in houses where condensation had built up and then frozen inside the plaster. Streets flooded, basements filled. The repair costs across Britain ran into tens of millions of pounds at 1,963 values. But the families who had banked their fires correctly, who had sealed their windows with blankets and paper, who had moved the household into one room and cooked their broths and slept in their coats, those families emerged from 77 days of siege with their pipes intact and their children healthy. The knowledge worked. It had been built over generations specifically for this purpose, for islands that were cold, damp, poorly built, and underfunded. And it worked. Every single method described in this file has now largely disappeared from British domestic life. Central heating arrived in working-class homes through the late 1960s and 1970s, and with it, the pressure to know any of this dissolved. There was no longer a reason to bank a fire if you had a thermostat. There was no longer a reason to know about stone hot water bottles if the radiator in the bedroom would do the work while you slept. The knowledge was not recorded. It was not archived. It was not taught in schools or written into manuals. It existed only in the people who had used it. And those people are now in their 80s and 90s, and they are leaving. This file is part of the effort to hold what remains before it goes entirely. If you lived through the 1963 freeze, or if your parents or grandparents told you how they managed that winter, leave a note below. What room did your family retreat to? What did you sleep under? What did you burn when the coal ran out? Every comment is part of the archive. This was file number 14. There are 99 more in the archive. Subscribe and turn the page with us.